My parents always called me the dumb one, while my sister got a full ride to Harvard. On her graduation day, Dad stood up to toast her, announcing she would inherit everything, a brand new Tesla and a $15 million mansion. I was sitting in the back, quietly picking at my food, completely ignored. Until a stranger in a tailored suit walked into the private dining room, handed me a sealed envelope, and whispered that it was time to show them who I really am. I am Kendra, 35 years old, and my family had no idea that while they were busy treating me like a failure, I was busy buying out the very legacy they were so proud of. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been the black sheep of your family and had to prove your own worth in silence. The Atlanta heat in July is famously relentless, pressing down on the city with a thick, suffocating humidity, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the stifling emotional atmosphere of my family gatherings. I pulled my modest sedan up to the valet stand of one of the most exclusive restaurants in Buckhead. It was the kind of establishment that did not bother putting prices on the menu, where the valets wore crisp tailored uniforms and whisked away European luxury vehicles without a second glance. I handed over my keys and walked through the heavy glass doors, instantly hit by the blast of air conditioning and the overwhelming scent of expensive perfume and roasted garlic. This was my parents' territory. Terrence and Brenda had built a regional logistics company from the ground up, turning a modest fleet of delivery trucks into a massive corporate empire that made them local royalty in the affluent circles of the city. They were entirely obsessed with high society image charity galas and rubbing elbows with the political and financial elite. Today was meant to be the absolute crowning jewel of their decades-long social climbing efforts. We were here to celebrate my younger sister Aaliyah graduating from Harvard Law School. Walking into the private dining room, the sheer opulence of the event was almost overwhelming. Enormous crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering glow over massive floral centerpieces, overflowing with white roses and rare orchids. A jazz trio played softly in the corner, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to the clinking of crystal glasses and the low murmur of wealthy networking. The room was packed with my parents' country club friends, local politicians they had funded, and Alia's new Ivy League circle of friends. I immediately felt the familiar heavy sting of isolation wrap around my chest. The hostess checked my name against a gold-embossed clipboard and walked me past the center of the massive mahogany table where the guests of honor sat in their glory. She guided me past the influential friends, the local judges, the wealthy benefactors, and directed me to the very far end of the room. My assigned seat was positioned right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen, where the waitstaff rushed in and out with heavy trays of food. It was a physical, undeniable manifestation of my place in this family. I was an afterthought. I was a familial duty that had been fulfilled and quickly pushed to the margins, where I would not ruin the aesthetic. I sat down and watched from a distance as Aaliyah worked the room with practiced ease. At 32 years old, she was the golden child in every conceivable sense of the word. She wore a tailored white designer suit that probably cost more than my first car. Her hair flawlessly styled, her smile bright and perfectly calculated. She possessed an arrogant confidence, a fierce, razor-sharp competitiveness that my parents had nurtured, funded, and rewarded since she was a toddler. To them, Alia was the ultimate return on their investment, the shiny trophy they could parade around Atlanta to prove their genetic superiority. I, on the other hand, was their living cautionary tale. I wore a simple off-the-rack navy blue dress that was clean and professional, but completely unremarkable to the highly trained eyes of the women in my family. I had left home years ago, walking away from the traditional business degree they tried to force upon me to forge my own path in the tech world, a path they deemed highly unstable and foolish. They truly believed I was struggling to pay rent in some cramped apartment, taking on low-paying freelance graphic design gigs just to survive the month. They did not know that I had spent the last decade building a financial technology platform that was currently revolutionizing mobile payment processing across the globe. They did not know because they never cared enough to ask me a single question about my life. The psychological warfare began almost as soon as the first round of imported champagne and fresh mimosas was poured. Connor, Aaliyah's husband, slid into the empty mahogany chair right next to me. Connor came from generations of old money, a white man of 34 who possessed a specific brand of condescension that was so thoroughly wrapped in polite Southern concern that you almost wanted to thank him for insulting you. He settled into his seat, adjusting his expensive silk tie, and looked me up and down. His eyes lingered for a fraction of a second on the unbranded fabric of my dress, tracing the simple seams, before settling on my face with a pitying, tight-lipped smile. "Kendra, it is so good to see you making it out today," he said smoothly, his voice dripping with faux sincerity. "We honestly were not sure if you could afford to take the time off from your little jobs to fly down here." I took a very slow, deep breath, keeping my posture straight and my expression entirely neutral. "I manage my schedule just fine, Connor," I replied softly. "Thank you for the concern." He chuckled, a soft, patronizing sound that grated against my ears. "I am just saying, if you ever need help getting your finances in order, I would be more than happy to sit down with you and look at your budget. You really should not be keeping whatever meager savings you have just sitting in a basic checking account. Inflation will eat a girl like you alive in this economy. Have you ever looked into index funds, or maybe setting up a simple retirement account? I know the barrier to entry seems incredibly high when you are living paycheck to paycheck, but compounding interest is a beautiful thing. I can walk you through the very basics of investment strategy if the numbers are not too overwhelming for you to grasp." The sheer audacity of his unsolicited mansplaining was almost breathtaking in its ignorance. Here was a man whose grandfather trust fund paid his mortgage and funded his leisurely lifestyle, taking it upon himself to explain the concept of basic interest to a woman who had just negotiated a highly complex, multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. His microaggressions were a constant, exhausting feature of our family dynamic. He used them constantly to assert his dominance, to remind me that I was the struggling, uneducated sister-in-law who severely lacked the sophisticated financial literacy of his privileged world. I smiled politely, calmly folding my hands in my lap to hide any trace of irritation. "I truly appreciate the generous offer, Connor, but my financial portfolio is being handled by a very competent team right now. I think I am on the right track for my future." He patted my shoulder in a heavy-handed gesture that felt significantly more like a physical reprimand than a sign of affection. "That is the spirit, Kendra. Fake it until you make it. Just do not wait too long to get serious about your future. You are not getting any younger, and those little freelance computer gigs will not sustain you forever. The real world requires real capital." He turned his back to me completely then, leaning over the table to engage a local city judge in a loud conversation about golf courses, deeply satisfied with his perceived charity toward the family failure. I did not argue with him. I let him bathe in his blinding arrogance, knowing exactly what was coming. Before I could even fully process the sheer weight of Connor's insulting advice, my mother decided it was her turn to take the floor. Brenda sat a few seats down the long table, perfectly positioned to hold court among her oldest and wealthiest friends. She wore a stunning emerald green silk gown, her heavy diamond necklace catching the light from the chandeliers every single time she gestured with her hands. The conversation around her end of the table had inevitably turned to parenting, discipline, and the ultimate success of children, which had always been her absolute favorite topic of discussion. She sighed loudly, a dramatic exhalation designed specifically to ensure her voice carried over the smooth jazz music and the clinking of heavy silverware, so that the relatives sitting nearby could hear every single word she was about to say. "Raising children is such a massive gamble," she lamented, shaking her head tragically, as if carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. "You give them all the exact same opportunities, the same expensive private schools, the same tutors, the same incredible advantages, and yet they turn out so drastically different. Look at my beautiful Aaliyah. Harvard Law. Driven, fiercely focused, practically born with a briefcase in her hand and a vision in her mind. She understands the heavy weight of the family legacy and respects the sacrifices we made to get here. One of her close friends murmured in loud agreement, casting a brief, highly uncomfortable glance down the table in my direction. Brenda did not miss a single beat. She absolutely thrived on this tragic narrative. And then you have Kendra. My mother continued her tone, dropping into a theatrical hushed whisper that was expertly calibrated to be overheard by everyone in our section of the room. I just do not understand it. I really do not. She always lacked that drive, that spark of ambition that runs in our blood. We tried so incredibly hard to instill excellence in her, to show her how to navigate the corporate world with grace and intelligence. But some people simply do not have the intellectual stamina for real tangible success. It breaks a mother heart to see her own flesh and blood settling for such profound mediocrity, bouncing around playing games on her computer in some tiny apartment, while her younger sister goes out and builds an empire. We pray for her constantly. We really do. We pray she finds some sort of direction before it is too late. The words hit my chest exactly as she intended them to. It was the exact same tired script she had recited at holidays, birthdays, and church gatherings for years, permanently cementing my lifelong role as the family scapegoat. In my family, excellence was not just a personal goal. It was a heavy, blunt weapon used to bludgeon anyone who dared to step out of line or challenge their authority. My mother absolutely loved playing the role of the long-suffering, endlessly patient parent who had done her absolute best with a deeply flawed, disappointing child. I felt the burning, judgmental stares of my aunts and uncles pressing into my skin, hearing the whispered pity of the country club set, analyzing my unadorned dress and quiet demeanor. Years ago, this specific kind of public humiliation would have sent me running to the restaurant bathroom in tears, locking myself in a stall to hyperventilate. I would have spent days questioning my fundamental worth, agonizing over why my own mother found such immense joy in tearing me down to elevate my sister. But today was entirely different. Today I did not argue back. I did not raise my voice to defend my career choices or try to desperately explain the complex revolutionary algorithms I had spent years coding in the dark. I just smiled softly, picked up my phone from my lap, and tapped the glowing screen. My private inbox was currently flooded with highly encrypted emails from my elite legal team in New York. The subject lines were incredibly discreet, using coded project names, but the actual contents were explosive. The final financial signatures were currently being authenticated by the holding company. The massive transfer of institutional funds was officially initiating across global servers. I sat at the reject end of the table, listening to my own mother mock my intelligence and my brother-in-law, pity my bank account, all while silently monitoring an email thread that confirmed I was officially closing the sale of NovaPay. I was reading direct messages from top-tier investment bankers welcoming me to a staggering tax bracket my arrogant parents could not even begin to fathom. I let my mother continue her tragic self-serving monologue about her dumb, disappointing daughter. I simply picked up my glass, took a slow, refreshing sip of my iced water, and waited, knowing with absolute certainty that the perfect storm was about to hit this dining room. The clinking of a silver spoon against crystal cut sharply through the low hum of conversation. The jazz trio immediately faded into silence. All eyes turned toward the head of the table where my father stood. Terrence commanded attention effortlessly. He smoothed the lapels of his custom charcoal suit, a garment that cost more than the average person made in a month, and surveyed the room with the practiced authority of a self-made king. He waited just long enough for the silence to become absolute, ensuring every politician, every country club acquaintance, and every Ivy League graduate was hanging on his next word. He raised his champagne flute high. To Aaliyah, he boomed, his voice resonating off the dark mahogany walls. Tonight we celebrate not just a graduation, but the continuation of a legacy. When Brenda and I started our logistics company 30 years ago, we had nothing but a single delivery truck and a vision. We poured our blood, our sweat, and our tears into building an empire so that our children would never have to know the struggle of starting from the bottom. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Aaliyah smiled demurely, resting her chin on her perfectly manicured hand. My father paced slowly behind his chair, soaking in the admiration. He loved this narrative. He loved playing the role of the visionary patriarch who had single-handedly lifted our family into the upper echelons of Atlanta society. But building an empire is only half the battle. My father continued his tone, shifting into something heavier, something distinctly darker. The real test is passing that empire down. Generational wealth requires generational discipline. It requires heirs who possess the intellectual stamina and the ruthless drive to protect what has been built. Aaliyah has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that she possesses that drive. Harvard Law is no small feat. She weathered the sleepless nights, the grueling exams, and the relentless pressure, and she emerged victorious. He paused, taking a slow sip of his champagne. Then, predictably, his gaze drifted away from the guest of honor. His eyes traveled the length of the long table, skipping over the wealthy benefactors and local judges until they locked directly onto me. The warmth completely vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, hard disappointment that I had seen 1,000 times before. Unfortunately, my father said, lowering his glass, that level of discipline is not something you can simply teach. You either have it or you do not. Some of you in this room remember the high hopes I had for my oldest daughter. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The comfortable celebratory energy vanished, replaced by a tense, suffocating awkwardness. Guests shifted in their heavy leather chairs, suddenly finding the rims of their water glasses incredibly interesting. Connor leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest with a satisfied smirk, while my mother offered a tragic synchronized sigh. I remember the day I paid the tuition for Kendra to attend the premier business program at our state university. My father announced, his voice projecting clearly so that not a single syllable would be missed. I handed her the golden ticket, a direct pathway to an executive suite in our company. I laid out the blueprint for her success. All she had to do was show up, put in the work, and claim her rightful place in the family business. He shook his head slowly, a masterclass in patriarchal sorrow. But she could not handle the pressure. While Aaliyah was in the library securing her future, Kendra was skipping lectures to play around with computer graphics and coding forums. And then came the day she walked into my office and told me she was dropping out. A collective quiet gasp echoed from a few of Aaliyah's friends who were unaware of my full family history. My father let the shock settle over the room before delivering the final blow. She threw it all away. She abandoned her education, rejected the family legacy, and walked out on the opportunity of a lifetime, because real business was simply too difficult for her to grasp. She chose the easy way out. She chose a life of aimless wandering and freelance gigs over the hard, disciplined work required to build true wealth. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting quietly in my lap. I did not break eye contact with him. I did not let my shoulders slump, and I absolutely did not let a single tear form in my eyes. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was not just praising Aaliyah, he was using my perceived failure as the dark backdrop to make her achievements shine even brighter. I was the sacrificial lamb on the altar of their social climbing. I thought I dropped out because I was lazy. He thought I failed because the traditional business curriculum was too rigorous. The truth, which I had kept buried for a decade, was that his beloved business program was painfully obsolete. While his professors were teaching outdated supply chain models, I was in my dorm room writing predictive algorithms that could process mobile financial transactions in milliseconds. I did not drop out because I could not handle the pressure. I dropped out because staying in that classroom was suffocating my potential. I dropped out to write the foundational code for NovaPay, the very company that was currently changing the global financial landscape. Let Kendra be a reminder to all of the young, ambitious minds in this room today, my father proclaimed, raising his glass once more. Opportunity is a privilege, not a right. When you are handed the keys to the kingdom, you do not throw them in the dirt. You grasp them with both hands and you build. Aaliyah understood the assignment. She proved that she is the only one in this family with the pedigree and the intelligence to carry our name into the next century. He raised his glass toward my sister. To Aaliyah, the true heir, the one who stayed the course. To Aaliyah, the room echoed in a unified, booming chorus. Glasses clinked all around me. Connor raised his whiskey glass in my direction, offering a mocking little salute before taking a drink. I kept my hands resting calmly on the white tablecloth. I did not touch my water glass. I just watched them celebrate my absolute destruction. The heat of their collective judgment bore down on me, heavy and suffocating. They looked at me and saw a broke, uneducated failure who was entirely dependent on their occasional scraps of pity. Right beneath the edge of the table, my phone buzzed against my leg. A silent, steady vibration. I glanced down. It was a direct message from Elias, my lead acquisitions attorney in New York. The text contained no special characters, no exclamation points, just a simple string of words that carried more weight than any speech my father could ever give. Funds have cleared escrow. Wire transfer complete. You are officially liquid. I locked my phone screen and slipped it back into my pocket. I looked back up at my father, who was now taking his seat amidst a round of thunderous applause. He looked so incredibly proud of himself, so deeply convinced of his own superiority and my profound stupidity. I let a small, completely genuine smile touch the corners of my mouth. He had absolutely no idea that the daughter he just publicly humiliated had generated more wealth in a single afternoon than his entire logistics company had produced in 3 decades. I took a slow, quiet breath, letting the anticipation settle into my bones as the dinner service continued. The waiters arrived in a seamless, highly choreographed wave, clearing the salad plates and replacing them with the main courses. The heavy scent of seared sea bass and truffled filet mignon wafted through the private dining room. The brief silence brought on by the arrival of the food did not last long. Connor sliced into his steak with deliberate precision, chewing slowly before aiming his gaze right back down the table at me. The champagne was clearly making him bolder. So Kendra Connor began, his voice easily carrying over the soft jazz playing from the corner speakers. I have always been genuinely curious. How exactly does one survive without a safety net in this economy? I mean, after Terrence cut the cord and you walked away from the family resources, what was the game plan? Did you just hope to magically stumble into a trust fund of your own? Alia let out a sharp, melodic laugh that she hid behind her linen napkin. Connor, do not interrogate her. Aaliyah scolded lightly, though her eyes danced with obvious amusement. She probably had a very solid plan. Freelancing is highly respectable work. I am sure making logos for local bakeries pays the rent perfectly fine. I cut a small piece of my sea bass, placing my fork down gently. I pay my rent just fine, Aaliyah, I replied, my voice steady and entirely devoid of the defensive anger they were so desperately trying to provoke. My father scoffed from the head of the table. You pay rent because we taught you the hard way what the real world costs, Terrence declared loudly. He pointed his steak knife in my direction, using it as a prop to command the attention of the surrounding guests. I will never forget the day you walked out of my office. You were so completely full of yourself, so convinced that your little computer hobby was going to change the world. You thought I was bluffing when I said I would shut off the financial tap. Brenda leaned forward, placing her hand over her heart in a practiced display of maternal suffering. It was the hardest thing we ever had to do as parents, she announced to the table at large. The women sitting near her nodded in sympathetic unison. We had to show tough love. The very next morning, we called the wealth manager at the bank. We froze her checking account, her savings, even the emergency credit line. I personally packed up the designer clothes we had bought for her and put them in storage. We told the doorman at our building not to let her up unless she was ready to formally apologize and re-enroll in the business program. I took a slow sip of my water, letting the cold liquid wash down my throat as I listened to them rewrite history. They called it tough love. I called it a targeted financial execution. I remembered that day vividly. I had exactly $42 in my wallet when my bank card declined at a campus coffee shop. They had not just cut off my discretionary spending. They had canceled my health insurance, terminated my phone plan, and refused to co-sign the lease on a basic off-campus apartment. They wanted to strip away every single resource I had, so I would be forced to crawl back to their mansion on my hands and knees, begging for a junior analyst position at a company I despised. We honestly thought you would last maybe 3 weeks, Terrence said, chuckling darkly as he took a drink of his wine. We gave it a month tops. We figured the reality of paying your own utility bills would break that stubborn streak. But you just vanished into some cheap rundown neighborhood and refused to answer our calls. You chose to live in poverty rather than admit your father was right. I chose to live in peace, I corrected him softly. Alia rolled her eyes, her heavy diamond earrings swinging with the motion. Peace is just a convenient word for avoiding responsibility, Kendra. You had it so incredibly easy. You got to run away and play the starving artist without any expectations weighing you down. Do you have any idea how exhausting it was for me to carry the entire family legacy on my shoulders? While you were hiding out in some tiny studio apartment, I was dealing with the crushing pressure of the Harvard admissions process. Connor immediately jumped in to validate his wife. Exactly. Aaliyah had the weight of the world on her. The family had to invest heavily to make sure she was positioned for success. We are talking premium LSAT tutors, moving expenses for her luxury apartment in Boston, the wardrobe required for Ivy League networking events. Terrence and Brenda poured their absolute best resources into Aaliyah because they knew she was a guaranteed return on investment. The blatant hypocrisy of their narrative was almost impressive. Aaliyah sat there acting as if being handed a fully funded $500,000 education and a luxury penthouse was a profound hardship. Meanwhile, during those exact same years, I was sleeping on a mattress on the floor of a drafty apartment. I was working the overnight shift at a commercial printing press just to pay for the dedicated servers I needed to run my code. I spent my days eating cheap noodles and my nights writing the complex security protocols that would eventually become the foundation of NovaPay. But as I sat there listening to them brag about cutting me off, a profound sense of gratitude washed over me. By freezing my accounts and abandoning me financially, my parents had inadvertently given me the greatest gift of my life, total independence. Because they refused to give me a single dime of seed money, they held absolutely zero equity in my company. They possessed no legal claim to my intellectual property, no shares in my holding company, and no access to the massive fortune that had just been wired into my private accounts. Their cruelty had legally insulated my empire from their greed. It takes a very specific caliber of intellect to handle real capital. Brenda chimed in again, directing her words toward a wealthy local politician sitting across from her. That is why we focused our energy on Aaliyah. You cannot just guess your way through high finance and asset management. It requires pedigree. It requires a sophisticated understanding of how the world truly works. Kendra is a sweet girl, but she simply does not have the head for numbers. Connor nodded vigorously in agreement. That is why I offered to look over her budget earlier. Honestly, Kendra, if you even meet the income threshold to file taxes this year, I have an excellent guy downtown who helps low-income independent contractors avoid getting flagged by the IRS. It is the least I can do for family. I would hate to see you get audited over some miscalculated grocery receipts. I appreciate the offer, Connor, I said, maintaining my serene smile. But my accounting team is exceptionally thorough. I do not think the IRS will be an issue for me. Connor snorted, shaking his head as he cut another piece of steak. An accounting team. Right. I am sure the local tax prep kiosk down the street is doing a stellar job for you. Just let me know when you inevitably need a bailout. I looked down the length of the table at my family. They were entirely wrapped up in their own delusions of grandeur, feeding off each other's arrogance like parasites. They had spent the last hour meticulously tearing down my character, my intelligence, and my work ethic, entirely convinced that I was a broken, defeated woman who had showed up to this dinner just to beg for their acceptance. They were positioning themselves as the generous, long-suffering elite, completely unaware that the ground beneath their custom-tailored shoes was about to crack wide open. The waiters returned to clear the main courses, making way for the dessert service and the formal champagne toast. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling the slight weight of my phone against my leg. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was primed. My father pushed his chair back from the table and stood up once again, adjusting his tie with a look of supreme self-importance. The room immediately quieted down, anticipating the main event of the evening. The big announcement regarding the family trust was imminent, and I was more than ready to watch them play their final fatal hand. My father cleared his throat, a deep, resonant sound that demanded absolute submission from everyone in his orbit. As he raised his hands to signal the waiters to pour the final round of vintage champagne, my phone vibrated a second time against my thigh. This was not a simple text message from my attorney. This was the highly secure, encrypted notification I had been waiting for all evening. I carefully slipped the device from my pocket, keeping it completely shielded below the heavy linen tablecloth. The screen illuminated my lap with a faint blue glow, revealing a direct link from the holding company managing the corporate acquisition of NovaPay. I tapped the notification utilizing facial recognition to bypass the strict biometric security wall. The digital document loaded instantly onto my screen. It was the final executing agreement, the absolute last step before the funds were irrevocably locked into my private accounts. I scrolled swiftly through the dense legalese, scanning the pages of corporate jargon that outlined the complete transfer of my intellectual property, the restructuring of my executive board, and the staggering financial compensation that would immediately follow. Up at the head of this table, Terence began his grand preamble. He spoke loudly to the room about the heavy burden of leadership, the grueling reality of asset management, and the terrifying responsibility of securing a financial dynasty for the next generation. He used words like equity and leverage with the dramatic flair of a televangelist preaching to a devoted congregation. He wanted everyone in that private dining room to believe he was an untouchable titan of industry. I listened to his booming voice while my thumb hovered directly over the digital signature block on my screen. He was currently bragging to a local judge about a regional logistics contract his company had secured last quarter, a deal worth a few $100,000. He spoke about it as if he had single-handedly conquered the global market. I swiped my finger across the glass screen, signing my name in a smooth, fluid motion. I hit submit. A green checkmark appeared, followed by a brief loading screen, and then the final confirmation message, transaction complete. In that precise fraction of a second, I officially became one of the wealthiest self-made women in the country. The sheer magnitude of the moment washed over me, a silent, invisible tidal wave that rearranged the entire foundation of my existence. I did not gasp. I did not jump out of my mahogany chair. I simply locked my phone, slipped it back into my pocket, and folded my hands neatly on the table. My mother caught my eye from across the massive floral centerpieces. She entirely mistook my serene posture for submission. She offered me a tight, sympathetic smile, the specific kind you give to a stray dog shivering in the rain. She truly believed I was sitting there reflecting on my colossal life failures, drowning in regret, because I had walked away from the family fortune years ago. She thought the absolute silence I was projecting was born of deep, inescapable shame. She could not comprehend that it was the silence of absolute victory. Connor leaned toward Aaliyah, whispering something in her ear that made her cover her mouth to stifle a harsh laugh. They cast a sideways glance in my direction. They were undoubtedly mocking my stoic demeanor, assuming I was too intimidated by the luxurious surroundings and their Ivy League credentials to speak up. It was genuinely fascinating to watch them operate in real time. They were completely blinded by their own privilege, convinced that wealth could only be inherited, married into, or granted by the patriarchal graces of a man like my father. The concept of building a technology empire from a mattress on the floor was fundamentally alien to their entire worldview. I took a moment to observe the fine details of the room. The extravagant crystal chandeliers overhead, the premium Wagyu beef remnants being cleared away by the staff, the expensive emerald silk of my mother gown. This entire graduation dinner, this extravagant display of generational wealth, was nothing more than a carefully constructed, highly fragile facade. I knew the dark truth about their finances. I knew the family logistics company was bleeding capital, suffocating under the weight of outdated operational models and terrible executive decisions. They were spending money they did not actually have to maintain an illusion they could no longer afford. I felt a profound sense of calm settle deep into my chest, a feeling so foreign, it almost surprised me. For 35 years, I had allowed these people to dictate my worth. I had internalized their insults, carrying the heavy label of the dumb one like a physical weight strapped to my back. I had spent my early 20s desperate for their validation, crying myself to sleep when they ignored my academic milestones and threw massive parties to celebrate my sister for basic achievements. But sitting here tonight, watching them preen and posture for their high society friends, I realized they had never actually possessed the power to define me. I had handed that power to them, and tonight I was taking it back completely. The waiters moved swiftly around the table, pouring the golden champagne into tall crystal flutes. One waiter approached my isolated section at the end of the table, offering a polite professional nod as he filled my glass. I thanked him quietly. He was the only person in this entire establishment who had treated me with an ounce of genuine respect tonight. As the tiny bubbles rose to the surface of my glass, I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent coding in absolute isolation. I thought about the severe panic attacks, the skipped meals, the ruthless investor meetings, where I was the only black woman in the room, constantly underestimated, routinely dismissed, and forced to prove my competence 10 times over. I had fought tooth and nail for every single inch of ground I gained in the tech industry. I had built NovaPay with an aggressive, unrelenting focus because failure was never an option. I did not have a family safety net to fall back on when things got difficult. I only had my own intellect and my own resilience. And now, the brutal battle was over. The company was sold. The massive capital was secure in my holding accounts. The war I had been fighting in the shadows for a decade was officially won. Terrence raised his hands, signaling for the room to quiet down once more. The ambient chatter ceased entirely, the silence thick with anticipation. Guests turned their heavy leather chairs toward the head of the table, their faces flushed with expensive alcohol and eager curiosity. The time had come for the ultimate performance. My father cleared his throat again, his chest puffing out beneath his tailored suit. He was preparing to deliver the final, crushing blow he had been building up to all evening. He was getting ready to publicly disinherit the family disappointment and pass the crown to his golden child. I picked up my champagne flute, the cool crystal grounding me firmly in the present moment. I looked directly at my father down the length of the table, my face a perfect mask of polite attentiveness. I was ready. I wanted him to say the words. I wanted him to lay all his cards on the table to expose his absolute cruelty and arrogance to the entire room of his peers. I needed him to climb to the very highest peak of his inflated ego because the impending fall was going to be spectacular. "My friends, my colleagues, my family," Terrence bellowed, spreading his arms wide as if he were preparing to embrace the entire restaurant. He projected his voice from the diaphragm, a technique he had paid an executive speech coach thousands of dollars to perfect. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate academic excellence, yes. But we are also here to witness the passing of a torch. We are here to talk about the future of Vanguard Logistics and the preservation of Black wealth." A murmur of profound respect washed over the private dining room. Brenda nodded solemnly from her seat, her emerald silk gown rustling as she reached out to gently pat Aaliyah on the hand. This was the core ideology of my parents' entire existence. They wielded the concept of generational wealth not as a tool for uplift or community empowerment, but as an exclusive glittering club meant to separate themselves from anyone they deemed inferior. They loved the aesthetics of empire building. They loved the power it gave them over other people. When you build an enterprise from the dirt up, Terrence continued pacing slowly behind his chair with the deliberate measured steps of a seasoned trial lawyer. When you lay the foundation with your own two hands, you quickly realize that the hardest part of business is not making the money. It is protecting the money. It is ensuring that the empire you built does not crumble the second you take your hands off the wheel. Vanguard Logistics is not just a fleet of freight trucks. It is a regional powerhouse. We are moving goods across 5 states, securing massive governmental contracts, and establishing a footprint that will outlast every single person sitting in this room today. He paused, letting the sheer weight of his own manufactured mythology settle over the guests. The local city judge seated near my mother raised his glass in silent tribute. Several other business owners nodded in deep, reverent agreement. They were entirely captivated by the performance. My father had an undeniable magnetism, a commanding physical presence that made it incredibly easy to believe every word that came out of his mouth. I watched him operate with a detached clinical fascination. I knew the logistics industry. I had built the payment processing software that streamlined vendor transactions for companies exactly like his. I knew the brutal razor-thin profit margins of freight transport. I knew the devastating impact of the recent diesel fuel spikes and the crippling cost of maintaining an aging commercial fleet. But listening to Terrence speak, you would think Vanguard Logistics was printing its own currency. He projected an image of absolute unshakable financial invulnerability. To protect an empire of this magnitude, you need a succession plan that is forged in steel, Terence announced, his voice dropping an octave to convey the immense gravity of his burden. You cannot leave a legacy to chance. You cannot leave it to hope. And you certainly cannot leave it in the hands of anyone who lacks the fierce, unrelenting discipline required to navigate the modern corporate landscape. Wealth is a heavy crown. If you place it on a weak head, it will snap their neck. Connor leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on my father with eager anticipation. He was practically vibrating with excitement. Connor had spent the last 4 years strategically ingratiating himself into my parents' good graces, playing the role of the humble, financially savvy son-in-law. He desperately wanted a piece of the Vanguard pie, and he knew that stroking my father's massive ego was the fastest way to get it. That is why Brenda and I have spent the last 6 months restructuring our entire family office, Terence revealed, sweeping his gaze across the room. We have sat down with the top estate planners in the state of Georgia. We have audited every single asset, every commercial property, every stock portfolio, and every holding company under the Vanguard umbrella. We took a long, hard look at the reality of our financial future. We had to make some incredibly difficult, unsentimental decisions about who is truly capable of carrying this family name forward. My mother sat up perfectly straight, her chin raised high, projecting the image of a fearless matriarch making the tough calls for the greater good. Aaliyah mirrored her posture, exactly a carbon copy of Brenda's aristocratic superiority. They were reveling in the tension, fully aware that the entire room was hanging on my father's next sentence. I took a slow breath, feeling the smooth fabric of my navy dress against my skin. The contrast between my internal reality and external environment was almost dizzying. Here I was, sitting silently at the dark end of the table, holding $49 million in liquid capital in a secure encrypted account. I had more wealth sitting quietly in my pocket than every single person in this dining room combined. I had built a technology infrastructure that processed billions of dollars in daily transactions. Yet in the eyes of my father, I was the weak link. I was the fragile, undisciplined child who could not be trusted to manage a checking account, let alone a corporate trust. We looked at our oldest commercial warehouses in Charlotte and Savannah, Terence said, listing off his assets like a general surveying his conquered territories. We looked at the family estate right here in Buckhead, the property we built to serve as the physical cornerstone of our dynasty. We looked at the fleet contracts, the investment portfolios, and the new fleet of luxury vehicles we just acquired for the executive team. We laid everything out on the table. And we realized that to protect these assets from mismanagement, we needed to consolidate our power. The guests were utterly silent now. The waitstaff had stopped moving, sensing the heavy importance of the speech, and stood quietly against the dark mahogany walls. I watched Connor reach under the table, likely squeezing Aaliyah's hand in a surge of greedy anticipation. They knew what was coming. They had undoubtedly been lobbying for this exact outcome behind closed doors for months, whispering poisonous, degrading comments about my lifestyle to my parents at every available opportunity. They had painted me as an unstable financial liability to ensure they secured the entire treasury for themselves. I looked at my father's face. I saw the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead, the slight tightness around his eyes. He was putting on a masterful show, but I knew the signs of a desperate man. Behind all the bravado, behind the booming voice and the custom suit, there was a frantic, terrifying need to maintain control. He was standing on a stage built entirely of debt and delusion, holding court over a kingdom made of sand. And he was about to use my public humiliation as the final, dramatic flourish to solidify his grand illusion. A legacy is not a charity, Terence declared, his voice ringing with absolute ruthless finality. A legacy is a business. You do not hand over the keys to the vault simply because someone shares your last name. Blood might get you a seat at the table, but only competence keeps you there. You reward the diligent. You elevate the brilliant. You invest in the child who actually respected the sacrifices you made to build the empire in the first place. You do not subsidize failure, and you certainly do not finance mediocrity. He turned his body, fully shifting his commanding presence away from the general audience and directing his intense, judgmental stare straight down the long table. His eyes locked onto mine, completely devoid of any paternal warmth. He was looking at me not as a daughter, but as a defective asset he was preparing to formally write off his ledger. The room followed his gaze, the heavy silence amplifying the crushing weight of his scrutiny. I kept my face perfectly still, meeting his cold stare with a calm, unwavering neutrality. I let him savor his moment of perceived dominance, waiting patiently for the absolute climax of his devastating announcement. Kendra, my father, finally said, his voice dropping into a register of profound theatrical sorrow that he had clearly practiced in the mirror for weeks. I say this to you tonight not out of anger, but out of a deep, abiding sense of paternal duty. I say this because the harsh reality of the corporate world does not care about your feelings, and it certainly does not care about your fragile artistic temperament. Wealth is a living, breathing entity. It requires a handler who is fierce, calculating, and entirely uncompromising. You have proven time and time again that you are simply not equipped to handle real assets. The collective intake of breath from the surrounding tables was audible. A few of the older, more conservative country club members shifted in their seats, exchanging uncomfortable glances. Public reprimands were one thing, but completely undressing your own daughter at a high society graduation dinner was a brutal spectacle, even for this crowd. Yet no one dared to intervene. My father was the man who wrote the checks for their charity galas and funded their political campaigns. They were perfectly willing to sit in absolute silence and watch him verbally execute his own child if it meant keeping their spot on his donor list. My mother rested her hand elegantly against her collarbone, projecting the image of a heartbroken matriarch forced to make an agonizing sacrifice for the greater good of the family name. Connor leaned forward so far, he was practically hovering over his empty dinner plate, his eyes wide with undisguised greed. He looked like a starving man watching a feast being laid out right in front of him. When you walked away from your education, my father continued, his voice steadily rising to fill the corners of the dining room, you did not just walk away from a degree. You demonstrated a catastrophic lack of judgment. You showed me that when the pressure mounts, when the stakes are at their absolute highest, you will fold. A person who crumbles under the weight of a simple college curriculum cannot be trusted to navigate market volatility, commercial real estate negotiations, or aggressive corporate expansions. You cannot run an empire with a mindset geared toward quitting. He turned his attention away from me, sweeping his gaze across the room to ensure every single guest was hanging on his every word. He wanted witnesses for what he was about to do. He needed the validation of his peers to make this moment feel like a historic, monumental transfer of power. Therefore, my father announced, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride, Brenda and I have officially finalized the complete restructuring of the Vanguard Family Trust. We have formally removed Kendra as a beneficiary of our primary holdings, our commercial properties, and our liquid capital reserves. The silence in the private dining room became thick and suffocating. It was the kind of absolute quiet that follows a car crash. He had actually done it. He had brought me to this lavish, sprawling celebration purely to look me in the eye and publicly cut me off from the generational wealth he never stopped bragging about. Effective immediately, my father declared, his voice ringing with ruthless triumph, the entirety of the Vanguard estate is being placed under the exclusive control of Aaliyah and her husband Connor. They are the sole inheritors of this legacy. They have demonstrated the intellectual fortitude and the unwavering loyalty required to protect our family name. Connor let out a sharp, breathless exhale, reaching under the table to grab Aaliyah by the hand. His face was flushed crimson with absolute victory. He had successfully manipulated his way into a southern logistics empire, and he could not even attempt to hide his massive, predatory grin. Aaliyah maintained her perfectly composed, demure posture, looking down at the table with a practiced look of humble gratitude, though the fierce, triumphant spark in her eyes gave her away completely. And because we believe in rewarding excellence, my father added, reaching into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored suit jacket. We are not waiting until we are gone to start passing down the fruits of our labor. He pulled out a heavy set of keys attached to a sleek, minimalist leather fob. He tossed them onto the mahogany table. The keys slid across the polished wood, coming to a stop directly in front of Aaliyah's plate. Aaliyah, my father, smiled, his face beaming with the kind of genuine warmth he had systematically denied me for my entire life. The valet has already brought your graduation present around to the front of the restaurant. It is a brand new, fully loaded Tesla Model S. We wanted to make sure you arrive at your new corporate law firm looking exactly like the formidable executive you were born to be. Alia let out a perfectly pitched gasp of delight, covering her mouth with her manicured hands. Oh my God, Dad, she breathed, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. This is too much. You did not have to do this. You earned every single piece of it, my father insisted, waving off her gratitude with a magnanimous gesture. But that is just a token of our appreciation. The real asset, the true cornerstone of our family dynasty, is the primary estate. He turned back to the crowd, eager to brag about his crowning achievement. The Vanguard Mansion in Buckhead, the $15 million property that Brenda and I built from the ground up, has officially been placed into an irrevocable trust in Aaliyah's name. The estate, the grounds, the art collection, everything inside those walls belongs to her and Connor. We are transferring the title free and clear. It is our way of ensuring that no matter what happens in the market, the true heirs of this family will always have a fortress to call their own. The dining room erupted into a fresh round of applause. The guests clapped politely, murmuring their congratulations to the golden couple. $15 million. It was a staggering, astronomical figure to the people sitting in that room. It was the kind of wealth that commanded absolute submission. The kind of money that made politicians return your phone calls and elite private schools clear their wait lists. I sat completely motionless at the far end of the table. I did not blink. I did not reach for my water glass. I just watched the disgusting theatrical display of greed unfolding right in front of me. I watched my father bask in the glow of his own perceived generosity. I watched my mother nod sagely, deeply satisfied that she had finally succeeded in exiling the embarrassing, uncooperative daughter from their perfect high society narrative. They thought they had destroyed me. They truly believed that publicly stripping me of my inheritance would shatter my spirit and reduce me to a sobbing, broken mess. They wanted me to feel the crushing, agonizing weight of missing out on $15 million. What they did not know, what they could not possibly comprehend in their wildest, most delusional dreams, was that I possessed the complete, unredacted financial portfolio of Vanguard Logistics. I knew exactly what that $15 million estate actually looked like on paper. I knew that the mansion was heavily leveraged, suffocating under 3 separate mortgages and a toxic, high-interest line of commercial credit that my father had desperately taken out to cover his failing shipping contracts. I was standing on a stage, proudly handing my sister the keys to a sinking ship. He was gifting her a massive, crumbling liability disguised as a generational blessing. And he was doing it all to punish me for a perceived lack of intelligence. The sheer brilliant irony of the moment washed over me, wrapping around my shoulders like a warm, comforting blanket. I was sitting at the reject end of the table holding a digital receipt for a $49 million liquid cash payout from the sale of my technology company. I had more untethered, unencumbered wealth resting in my pocket than my father had generated in his entire lifetime. I had built a ruthless, highly efficient tech empire from a tiny studio apartment while he was busy drowning his family legacy in commercial debt to maintain his country club memberships. I looked at Connor, who was now holding the Tesla keys, his eyes wide with the thrill of unearned wealth. I looked at Aaliyah, who was soaking up the applause of the room, entirely convinced she had just won the ultimate family lottery. I let them have their applause. I let them revel in the fake manufactured glory of my father's empty promises. I knew that the true cost of their arrogance was about to come due, and I was going to enjoy every single second of the fallout. As the applause for my father finally began to die down, Aaliyah pushed her heavy mahogany chair back and stood up. She smoothed the front of her pristine white designer suit, taking a deliberate moment to let the entire dining room focus completely on her. She possessed a terrifying ability to command space, a skill honed by years of mock trials and high-stakes debate stages. She picked up her champagne flute, holding it delicately by the crystal stem. and offered a soft, tremendously gracious smile to the room. Dad, Mom, words cannot begin to express the profound depth of my gratitude. Aaliyah began, her voice ringing with flawless, practiced humility. You built Vanguard Logistics from the ground up, fighting through every obstacle, breaking down every barrier to ensure that our family name stood for absolute excellence. You taught me that success is never handed to you. It is earned through blood, sweat, and unrelenting dedication. You set a standard of black excellence that I have spent my entire life striving to meet. She paused, placing a hand over her heart. The local city judge nodded in deep approval. Brenda dabbed at the corner of her eye with a cloth napkin, playing the role of the overcome mother to absolute perfection. I accept this immense responsibility with a full heart. Aaliyah continued, turning her gaze to the influential guests around the table. Connor and I understand the crushing weight of the legacy we are inheriting today. We promise to protect the Vanguard Empire, to grow it, and to honor the incredible sacrifices that made this transition of wealth possible. We will not let you down. Another wave of polite, sophisticated applause rippled through the room. Aaliyah let it wash over her, basking in the validation she craved like oxygen. But she was not finished. A true performance in my family required a victim, a designated focal point for their manufactured benevolence. Aaliyah could not simply claim her crown. She needed to step on my neck to make herself look taller. She turned her body slightly, directing her attention down the long table. Her sharp, calculating eyes locked directly onto mine. The triumphant gleam in her expression instantly melted away, replaced by a mask of deep, suffocating, fake sisterly concern. It was a terrifyingly quick transition, a masterclass in psychological manipulation. And to my older sister, Kendra, Aaliyah said, her voice dropping into a soft, pitying register that immediately hushed the entire room. I want you to know that today is not about leaving anyone behind. We all understand that success is simply not a linear journey for everyone. We know that the corporate world is harsh, and that not everyone possesses the specific kind of armor required to survive it. I kept my face entirely blank, watching her weave her toxic narrative. She was framing my independence as a tragic disability. She was positioning herself as the magnanimous victor, offering scraps to the defeated peasant. You have chosen a different, much quieter path in life, Aaliyah continued, offering me a tight, sympathetic smile that made my stomach churn. And while Mom and Dad have had to make some incredibly difficult financial decisions tonight to protect the primary estate, I want you to know that family is still family. Blood is still blood. Connor placed a supportive hand on Aaliyah's lower back, looking at me with an expression of profound, arrogant pity. The wealthy guests leaned in, entirely captivated by this display of high society charity. They were watching a wealthy heiress offer grace to her deadbeat sister, eating up every single second of the drama. I promise you, Kendra, Aaliyah announced, projecting her voice so that her benevolence echoed off the dark mahogany walls. I promise I will always make sure you have a roof over your head. No matter how tough things get with your little freelance projects, you will never have to worry about ending up on the street. You can always rent out our guest house. We will even give you a highly discounted family rate so you can afford to keep up with your payments. The room erupted. It was not a loud, boisterous sound, but a sharp, unified wave of polite, mocking laughter. The politicians chuckled into their crystal glasses. The wealthy benefactors shook their heads in amusement. Connor let out a harsh, audible snort of derision, completely abandoning his facade of polite concern. Brenda smiled benevolently, looking around the table as if to say, "Look at the incredible, forgiving daughter I raised." They were all laughing at me. They were laughing at the broke, uneducated failure who had just been publicly offered a discounted rental agreement in the backyard of her younger sister's $15 million estate. The humiliation was designed to be absolute, a crushing, inescapable weight, meant to break my spirit permanently. They fully expected me to drop my gaze, to flush red with profound embarrassment, perhaps even to stand up and rush out of the restaurant in a flood of pathetic tears. I did none of those things. I simply reached forward and wrapped my fingers around my crystal glass of sparkling water. The ice clinked softly as I lifted it to my lips. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cold carbonation dance across my tongue. I swallowed, placed the glass back onto the white tablecloth with precise care, and offered my sister a calm, unblinking smile. "Thank you, Alia," I said, my voice cutting through the dying laughter with a quiet, lethal clarity. "That is an incredibly generous offer. I will definitely keep your real estate management skills in mind." Alia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She did not like my tone. She expected a trembling, broken response, not the cool, detached amusement I was projecting. She narrowed her eyes, trying to detect a crack in my armor, but there was absolutely nothing for her to find. I was a fortress. As I sat there looking at my golden child sister in her pristine white designer suit, the sheer brilliant absurdity of the situation almost made me laugh out loud. Alia had spent 3 grueling years at Harvard Law School, studying complex contracts, property rights, and corporate liability. She had passed the bar exam. She considered herself one of the sharpest legal minds in Atlanta. Yet she was fundamentally, embarrassingly illiterate to the actual financial mechanics of her own family. She genuinely believed she was offering to rent me a guest house on a property she owned. She had absolutely no idea that the holding company, which quietly acquired the heavily defaulted deed to that exact $15 million estate, last Tuesday was registered solely under my name. She was standing in front of the city elite, magnanimously offering to charge me monthly rent to live in the backyard of a mansion that already belonged entirely to me. I let her spin her web of fake charity. I let Connor sit there swelling with unearned pride over an inheritance that consisted entirely of toxic commercial debt. I watched my parents beam with satisfaction, completely unaware that their logistical empire had been secretly bleeding out for 8 months, and that I was the anonymous buyer who had purchased their failing corporate notes just to liquidate them. They had spent the entire evening constructing a beautiful, glittering stage out of lies and arrogance. They had invited an audience of Atlanta's most influential people to witness my execution. But the play was over. The curtain was about to drop. My phone buzzed one final time in my pocket, signaling that the waiting period had ended. I kept my serene smile locked in place, staring directly into Aaliyah's confused, irritated eyes, knowing with absolute certainty that the heavy double doors at the back of the private dining room were about to swing wide open. The heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the private dining room did not simply open. They were pushed apart with a sudden commanding force that sucked the air right out of the room. The dull thud of the brass handles striking the padded walls echoed like a gunshot over the polite chatter. The jazz trio in the corner immediately stopped playing. The bassist fumbled with his strings, and the pianist froze with his hands hovering inches above the keys. The waiters, who had been seamlessly pouring coffee and clearing dessert plates, took a collective step back, flattening themselves against the floral wallpaper. The sudden interruption shattered the carefully curated atmosphere of my parents' high society celebration. Every single head in the room turned toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was Elias. He was a man who did not need an introduction in the upper echelons of Atlanta corporate circles. At 45 years old, Elias possessed a reputation that preceded him into every boardroom. He was a towering, impeccably dressed African-American man wearing a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit that projected absolute authority. He held a sleek premium leather portfolio in his left hand. He did not carry a briefcase. He did not wear a name tag. I did not need to. In the world of high-stakes mergers and aggressive corporate acquisitions, Elias was known as the apex predator. He was the legal mastermind who dismantled failing companies, liquidated their assets, and handed the keys over to anonymous buyers. His presence in this restaurant was the equivalent of a shark dropping into a swimming pool. Whispers immediately broke out among the local politicians and the wealthy country club members seated near my mother. I watched a prominent city judge lean over and speak frantically into the ear of a banking executive. They recognized him. They knew exactly how much power Elias wielded in the financial district. They knew that a man of his caliber did not show up to a graduation dinner on a Saturday night unless millions of dollars were actively changing hands. Alia dropped her triumphant smile. She gripped the stem of her champagne flute tightly, her perfectly manicured nails turning white. She looked confused and slightly annoyed that someone had dared to steal the spotlight during her moment of supreme glory. Connor sat up incredibly straight, his eyes darting between the doorway and my father. Connor worked in wealth management, which meant he undoubtedly knew Elias by reputation alone. I could see the gears turning in my brother-in-law head, desperately trying to calculate what an elite acquisitions attorney was doing crashing a family celebration. Brenda placed a hand over her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with shock. She looked at the hostess standing terrified in the hallway behind Elias, clearly wanting to demand how someone had bypassed the restaurant's strict security protocol. But she said nothing. The sheer gravity of Elias entering the room kept her firmly pinned to her velvet chair. At the head of the table, my father experienced an entirely different reaction. I watched Terrence's face transform from initial shock into a blinding, magnificent display of sheer arrogance. In his deeply delusional mind, there was only one logical explanation for this interruption. Terrence truly believed that he had finally arrived. He thought his speech about generational wealth, his boastful claims about Vanguard logistics, and his very public gifting of a $15 million estate had summoned the absolute top tier of Atlanta business elite to his table. Terrence smoothed his custom suit jacket, puffing his chest out to its absolute maximum capacity. He saw Elias not as a threat, but as the ultimate validation of his patriarchal empire. He assumed Elias had heard about the massive family trust restructuring and had personally come down to the restaurant to offer his congratulations, perhaps even to solicit a lucrative partnership with the newly appointed heirs of the Vanguard dynasty. My father buttoned his jacket with a swift, confident motion. He stepped away from his seat at the head of the table, projecting the image of a benevolent king stepping down from his throne to greet a visiting dignitary. He pasted on his most charismatic billion-dollar smile. It was the exact same fake charming smile he used to secure bank loans he could not afford and to manipulate local politicians into granting him zoning permits. I sat perfectly still at the far end of the room, my hands resting calmly on the white tablecloth. My heart was beating with a slow, powerful, rhythmic thud against my ribs. Elias and I had spent the last 8 months working together in absolute secrecy. When I realized that Vanguard Logistics was quietly defaulting on their commercial loans, I knew my parents would eventually try to liquidate my minimal childhood trust to cover their bleeding margins. I hired Elias to protect my assets. He was the one who helped me establish the blind holding company. He was the one who systematically purchased my parents' toxic debt from their panicked creditors. I was the one who filed the paperwork to acquire the deed to the $15 million Buckhead mansion. Elias knew every single dark, humiliating detail of my family history. He knew about the emotional abuse, the constant mockery, and the brutal financial cutoff they had subjected me to a decade ago. And more importantly, Elias was the only person in the world who knew that the quiet, plainly dressed woman sitting by the kitchen doors had just signed the final executing agreement on a $49 million tech acquisition. Elias stepped fully into the private dining room. The heavy mahogany doors swung shut behind him with a resonant click, sealing us all inside. He did not look at the floral centerpieces. He did not look at the crystal chandeliers. He kept his face completely devoid of emotion, a cold, calculating mask of pure corporate execution. Terrence walked purposefully down the length of the long table, stepping right into the center of the room to intercept him. My father was practically glowing with unearned pride. He wanted everyone in the room to see him rubbing elbows with the city's most feared acquisitions attorney. He wanted Aaliyah and Connor to witness the sheer magnitude of the legacy he was supposedly handing them. Elias, my father, boomed, his voice echoing off the walls with profound manufactured warmth. What an absolute honor. I had no idea you were dining at the establishment tonight. If I had known, I would have had the staff send a bottle of our best vintage to your table. Terrence closed the remaining distance between them. He stopped right in front of Elias, planting his feet wide to assert his dominance. He extended his right hand, thrusting it forward with the aggressive, firm posture of a man who believed he owned the entire building. He was expecting a firm handshake. He was expecting a respectful greeting. He was expecting Elias to look him in the eye and acknowledge him as an equal in the world of high finance. I leaned forward in my chair, just a fraction of an inch, my eyes locked on the space between them. The entire room held its collective breath. The local politicians leaned over their plates. Aaliyah watched with eager, hungry anticipation. Brenda smiled proudly at her powerful husband. They had spent the last 2 hours publicly executing my character. They had laughed at my expense, mocked my career, and legally stripped me of my place in the family. They were riding the highest wave of arrogance they had ever experienced. They were entirely unprepared for the absolute devastation that was walking right past them. Elias did not break his stride. He did not slow down. He did not even blink. My father stood there in the center of the private dining room, with his right hand thrust out, a billion-dollar smile frozen on his face, waiting for the validation he craved more than oxygen. Elias walked right past him. The gap between Elias and my father was less than 3 inches, but it might as well have been a massive, unbridgeable canyon. The complete and total dismissal was so casual, so profoundly effortless, that it took several seconds for my father to register what had just happened. Terrence stood there with his hands suspended in midair, grasping at absolutely nothing. I watched the blood rush to his cheeks, an angry, humiliated red that clashed violently with his charcoal suit. He slowly lowered his arm, his fingers curling into a tight fist against his side. He turned his body, his eyes wide with a frantic, bewildered panic, watching Elias march down the length of the mahogany table. The rhythmic, heavy sound of Elias' leather dress shoes, striking the polished hardwood floor, echoed through the dead silent room. Every single politician, every corporate executive, and every country club socialite held their breath. They watched the apex predator of the Atlanta financial district bypass the self-proclaimed king of logistics. Elias moved past my mother. Brenda pressed her back firmly against her velvet chair, completely terrified by the proximity of a man who possessed the legal power to liquidate her entire lifestyle before breakfast. She looked up at him with wide, uncomprehending eyes. Her hand remained frozen over her pearl necklace. Elias continued his march, stepping directly past the guests of honor. Aaliyah sat frozen in her pristine white designer suit. The smug, triumphant glow that had radiated from her pores just minutes ago was completely extinguished. She clutched her graduation gift, the keys to the brand new Tesla, so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Connor shrank back in his seat, visibly trying to make himself as small as possible. The arrogant wealth manager, who had just offered to help me balance my meager grocery budget, was suddenly confronted by a man who moved capital that dwarfed his entire generational trust fund. They were all waiting for Elias to stop at one of the wealthy investors seated near the middle of the room. They assumed he was here to serve papers on a rival executive or deliver a hostile takeover bid to one of the local bankers. It never once crossed their minds that he was heading for the dark, neglected corner by the kitchen doors. Elias did not stop until he reached the very end of the table. He stopped directly beside my chair. The collective shock that hit the dining room was a physical, tangible force. A local city judge dropped his silver fork, the heavy metal clanging loudly against his porcelain dessert plate. The sound was deafening, but nobody moved to pick it up. They were all staring at the impossible scene unfolding in front of them. The most powerful acquisitions attorney in the city was standing at absolute attention beside the family scapegoat, the uneducated dropout, the sister who had just been publicly disinherited and offered a discounted rental agreement in a guest house. Elias turned to face me. The cold, calculating corporate mask he wore for the rest of the room instantly dissolved. He looked down at me with profound, undeniable respect. This was the man who had seen my financial ledgers. This was the man who knew exactly how many lines of revolutionary code I had written while sleeping on a mattress on the floor. He knew the sheer brutal magnitude of the empire I had built in the shadows. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket in a smooth, deliberate motion. He withdrew a thick, premium leather folder. It was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, embossed with the subtle, discreet logo of his elite New York law firm. The leather was midnight black, heavy, and substantial. It held the finalized, legally binding closing documents of a corporate acquisition that would send shockwaves through the global technology sector by Monday morning. He held the folder with both hands, presenting it to me, not as a lawyer handing paperwork to a client, but as a general delivering a sword to his commander. I looked up at him, maintaining my calm, serene posture. I did not rush to take it. I let the moment hang in the air, allowing the crushing weight of the situation to slowly suffocate my parents and my sister. They were watching us with terrified, unblinking eyes. Their perfect, glittering high society facade was fracturing into a million jagged pieces, and they had no idea how to stop it. Elias leaned down slightly, closing the distance between us, so that his voice would not carry across the entire room. He did not need to shout. He did not need to make a grand theatrical spectacle like my father. The quiet, devastating truth was far more powerful than any loud boast. The holding company has authenticated the signatures. Elias whispered, his deep voice smooth and steady. The international wire transfers have cleared the final security protocols. The funds are entirely liquid and fully secured in your private accounts. You have total operational control. He placed the heavy leather folder gently onto the white tablecloth, right next to my crystal glass of sparkling water. He straightened his posture, crossing his hands in front of him, standing guard beside my chair like a loyal sentinel. "It is time, Kendra," he whispered softly. I placed my hands flat on the table, feeling the cool, polished wood beneath my fingertips. The frantic, desperate energy radiating from my family was palpable. My father was staring at the leather folder as if it were a bomb about to detonate. My mother looked like she was struggling to draw breath. Aliyah looked back and forth between me and Elias, her pristine legal mind completely failing to compute the basic facts presenting themselves right in front of her face. For 10 years, I had swallowed their insults. For 10 years, I had listened to them call me a failure, a disappointment, a cautionary tale. I had let them use my name as a punchline to elevate their own mediocre achievements. I had stayed silent while they spent a decade throwing away their logistics empire on bad investments and luxury vehicles to maintain a fake image of prosperity. But the silence was officially over. I shifted my chair back, the wooden legs scraping softly against the floor. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my simple off-the-rack navy blue dress. I did not need a $15 million mansion or a designer suit to validate my existence. I had built my worth with my own two hands, line by line, transaction by transaction. I reached out and placed my hand on the premium leather folder. The transaction was complete. The ultimate boundary was drawn. It was time to introduce my family to the woman they had spent a lifetime underestimating. I stood up, the wooden legs of my chair scraping softly against the polished floorboards. The sound drew every remaining ounce of attention in the room, pulling the eyes of the Atlanta elite away from my father and fixing them squarely on me. I rested my hand on the premium leather folder Elias had placed on the table, feeling the cool, textured surface beneath my fingertips. I did not open it immediately. I simply let my presence expand, shedding the invisible, shrinking posture I had been forced to maintain for 35 years. Elias turned his imposing frame to face the head of the table. He did not ask for permission to speak. He simply took control of the room with the effortless authority of a man accustomed to directing billionaires. Terrence Elias began, his voice booming with a rich, commanding resonance that rattled the crystal glasses on the mahogany table. "You were just speaking to your esteemed guests about the fierce, unrelenting discipline required to build an empire. You spoke about the rare intellect needed to navigate the modern corporate landscape. I completely agree with your assessment. In fact, I am standing here tonight to finalize the documentation for an empire that has just fundamentally reshaped the global financial sector." My father blinked, his face twitching with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope. He still clung to the delusion that this grand interruption was somehow about him. "Elias," my father stammered, attempting to project his usual confidence. "I deeply appreciate the sentiment, but the Vanguard Logistics expansion is a private family matter. We can discuss regional partnerships on Monday." Elias cut him off with a single sharp shake of his head. "I am not here for your logistics company," Terrence Elias stated, his tone completely stripped of any professional courtesy. "I am here for my client." Elias turned and gestured towards me. The collective gaze of the room followed his hand, snapping back to the woman in the plain navy dress standing by the kitchen doors. "For the past 10 years," Elias announced, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the private dining room, "while this family publicly dismissed her potential, Kendra has been operating as the sole founder and chief executive officer of Nova Pay." A sharp collective intake of breath swept through the high society guests. Connor gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned stark white. Nova Pay. He whispered the name, his wealth manager brain instantly short-circuiting. Everyone in the financial sector knew Nova Pay. It was the white whale of the tech industry, the elusive, brilliantly coded platform that was currently processing digital transactions for half the banks in the country. As of exactly 6 minutes ago, the final regulatory hurdles were cleared. Elias continued, his voice ringing with absolute unshakable triumph. The acquisition of NovaPay by an international banking consortium has officially closed. Kendra retained 100% equity in her company from day one. There were no angel investors to pay out. There were no venture capitalists holding preferred shares. And there are absolutely zero familial claims to her intellectual property. Elias reached behind him, signaling a junior associate who had been waiting quietly in the hallway corridor. The associate stepped into the room holding a large, rigid presentation board covered in dark velvet. Elias took the board and pulled away the velvet cover, revealing a pristine, oversized novelty check. He held it up high for the entire room to see. It was not a prop for a charity gala. It was not a promotional gimmick. It was the physical, undeniable manifestation of absolute power. Pay to the order of Kendra. Elias read aloud, making sure to enunciate every single syllable. $9 million, post-tax liquid capital. He turned and handed the massive check to me. I took it, holding the heavy board effortlessly across my waist. The silence in the private dining room was no longer just awkward. It was clinical. It was the absolute suffocating silence of a morgue. The air grew thick and heavy, pressing down on my family like a physical weight. The reality of the number echoed in their minds, breaking down their carefully constructed superiority complex with the force of a wrecking ball. $49 million. Liquid. Cash. Alia's jaw literally unhinged. The perfectly poised Harvard Law graduate, the golden child who had spent her entire life collecting academic trophies to prove her dominance, looked completely vacant. Her eyes darted frantically between the giant numbers printed on the check and my calm, unwavering face. She was entirely unable to process the math. She had just spent the last 20 minutes preening over a leased electric vehicle and a heavily mortgaged house. She had just offered to charge me rent to live in her guest house. Now she was staring at a sister who could buy her entire law firm and turn it into a storage closet. The sheer humiliation painted her face a splotchy, uneven red. Connor turned the color of wet ash. The blood drained so rapidly from his face I thought he might actually pass out directly into his dessert plate. This was the man who had patronizingly offered to help me avoid an IRS audit over my grocery receipts. He had mocked my freelance gigs. He had tried to mansplain basic compounding interest to a woman who had just executed a corporate buyout that dwarfed his entire generational trust fund. His arrogant, condescending smirk was completely obliterated, replaced by a look of profound, nauseating terror. Brenda's mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish pulled out of water. She clutched the fabric of her emerald silk gown, her chest heaving as she tried desperately to reconcile the reality standing in front of her. The daughter she had just publicly labeled a profound mediocrity, the child she had written off as a tragic failure, was holding a check that made her own wealthy lifestyle look like absolute child play. Brenda's entire identity was built on being the most successful, most affluent matriarch in the room. In 10 seconds I had dethroned her without raising my voice. And then there was Terrence, the self-proclaimed king of logistics, the patriarch who had just spent an hour publicly executing my character to elevate himself. He looked like a man who had stepped off a skyscraper and suddenly realized there was no safety net below him. His knees actually buckled, forcing him to grip the high back of his mahogany chair just to remain standing. His mouth worked furiously, his lips trembling as he tried to formulate a sentence, but absolutely no sound came out. The grand illusion of his absolute superiority was shattered into microscopic fragments. He was staring at the ultimate proof of his failure as a father and a businessman. He had thrown away a billionaire in the making because she refused to study his outdated supply chain textbooks. I looked at the check in my hands, feeling the smooth, glossy surface of the print. I did not gloat. I did not scream at them for their cruelty. I did not demand apologies for the decade of emotional abuse. I simply stood there, an immovable, triumphant force, letting the sheer crushing weight of my success suffocate their arrogance. The local politicians, the judges, and the elite guests were now staring at me with a mixture of profound shock and deep reverence. The balance of power in the room had shifted permanently. I was no longer the outcast sister taking up space by the kitchen doors. I was the wealthiest, most powerful person in the building, and my family was forced to choke on that undeniable truth. The crushing silence holding the private dining room hostage finally snapped. It did not break with a shout or a sudden commotion, but with a low electric hum of whispers sweeping across the heavy mahogany tables. The elite guests, the politicians, the banking executives who had just watched my father publicly crucify me were now murmuring to one another in hushed, reverent tones. The social hierarchy of the room was actively rewriting itself in real time. I was no longer the tragic, aimless daughter serving as a cautionary tale. I was a $49 million tech founder, an absolute titan standing in their midst, and they all recognized the sudden, undeniable shift in gravity. But nobody pivoted faster than my mother. Brenda possessed a terrifying, almost supernatural ability to manipulate reality, to serve her own ego. For 35 years, I had watched her twist narratives, erase her own cruelty, and reshape history, so that she always emerged as the benevolent matriarch. As the astronomical figure on the novelty check burned its way into her brain, the sheer shock on her face evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a masterclass in performative high society maternal affection. I could actually see the gears turning behind her perfectly applied makeup. She looked at the awestruck faces of her wealthy country club friends, and she immediately realized that she needed to claim absolute ownership of my success before the narrative slipped out of her manicured hands. "Oh, my beautiful baby girl!" Brenda cried out, her voice breaking with a sudden manufactured sob that echoed perfectly off the crystal chandeliers. She pushed herself away from the head of the table, her emerald silk gown rustling loudly as she practically sprinted down the length of the dining room. She shoved past a waiter holding a tray of coffee cups, completely abandoning her usual aristocratic grace in her desperate scramble to reach me. The tears forming in her eyes were a magnificent display of sheer biological control. She threw her arms open wide, aiming directly for my shoulders, preparing to pull me into a suffocating, tearful embrace in front of the entire assembly. "I always knew it," she wept, projecting her voice so that every single investor and judge in the room would hear her claim the victory. "I always knew my baby girl was just a late bloomer. I knew our tough love would push you to achieve your true potential. Look at what you have built for this family, Kendra. I am so incredibly proud of you." She lunged forward to wrap her arms around my neck fully, expecting me to collapse into her embrace like a desperate, approval-starved child. She expected me to play the role of the prodigal daughter returning home with riches to lay at her feet. I did not blink. I took one deliberate, measured step backward. The sudden movement created a wall of empty space between us. My mother stumbled forward slightly, her outstretched arms grasping at the cold air, where I had been standing just a fraction of a second before. Her heavy diamond necklace clattered against her chest as she caught her balance, her high heels skidding awkwardly against the polished hardwood floor. The rejection was incredibly public and entirely unmistakable. "Do not touch me," I said. My voice was not loud, but it was laced with a quiet, lethal authority that stopped her dead in her tracks. Brenda froze, her arms still awkwardly suspended in midair. The beautiful, tearful smile plastered across her face began to violently twitch. The room plunged back into an agonizing, suffocating silence. The guests stared in absolute shock. In the affluent circles of Atlanta society, a daughter publicly recoiling from her mother embrace was a profound, unforgivable scandal. But I did not care about their polite social contracts. I was completely done protecting my abusers. "Kendra, sweetheart," my mother stammered, lowering her arms slowly as a flush of genuine embarrassment crept up her neck. "What are you doing? We are celebrating you. We are celebrating your monumental success. This is a family victory. This is my victory." I corrected her smoothly, adjusting my grip on the heavy presentation board holding the check. "You do not get to claim a single percentage of this moment. You do not get to stand in front of your friends and pretend that your cruelty was somehow a strategic parenting decision. She took a nervous step forward, reaching out a single trembling hand toward my arm. Please do not cause a scene tonight, Kendra. She whispered, her voice dropping into a desperate, frantic hiss intended only for my ears. Everyone is watching us. Just hug me back. We can sort out whatever petty grievances you have tomorrow at the house. Do not embarrass your father like this. I looked down at her outstretched hand, then back up to her terrified, image-obsessed eyes. I took another firm step back, ensuring the physical boundary between us was absolute iron. You lost the right to worry about my behavior 10 years ago. I stated, raising my voice just enough so the surrounding tables could hear exactly what was being said. You lost that right the morning you froze my checking account, threw my belongings into storage, and told the doorman to ban me from your building. You did not show me tough love, Brenda. You tried to financially starve me into submission because I refused to be a prop in your perfect country club narrative. My mother gasped, placing her hand over her heart in a gesture of profound, wounded innocence. She whipped her head around, looking at her wealthy friends, her eyes silently begging them to intervene, to see her as the tragic victim of an ungrateful child. But her friends just stared back at her with wide, uncomfortable eyes. They had all heard my father's speech just 20 minutes ago. They had all listened to him call me a miserable failure. They could not reconcile the vicious woman who sat silently while her daughter was mocked with the weeping, loving mother standing before me now. You are deeply confused. Kendra Brenda pleaded, the desperation leaking out of her carefully controlled tone. You are overwhelmed by the money. We pushed you because we saw your brilliance. Everything we did was to prepare you for the harsh realities of the corporate world. We gave you the fundamental tools to succeed. You gave me a masterclass in conditional love. I shot back without a single ounce of hesitation. I built this company on a mattress on the floor of a studio apartment that had no heat. I built it while eating cheap noodles and working overnight shifts at a printing press. You did not build my resilience. You simply provided the trauma I had to survive. The stark, brutal honesty of my words hung in the warm air of the dining room. I watched the realization slowly wash over my mother's face. The undeniable truth was that she could not manipulate me anymore. Her tears held absolutely zero currency. Her maternal guilt trips were completely bankrupt. She was staring at a woman who had completely outgrown her need for parental validation. I looked past her, directing my gaze back to the head of the table. Aaliyah was still sitting in her chair, clutching the keys to a leased Tesla, her mouth pressed into a thin, furious line. Connor was rubbing his forehead, clearly spiraling into a deep panic over how he was going to recover his standing with me. And my father, Terrence, was finally beginning to move. The initial shock of the $49 million check had worn off, and his deeply ingrained patriarchal arrogance was rapidly booting back up. He was adjusting his suit jacket, marching down the length of the table with his jaw set in a hard, determined line. The motherly manipulation tactic had completely failed. It was time for the patriarch to step in and attempt to violently reassert his control over the family assets. Terrence stepped smoothly in front of my mother, physically blocking her from my view with his broad shoulders. He did not offer her a single glance of comfort or a word of support. In his mind, Brenda had completely failed her assignment. She had let raw emotion dictate her strategy, and in the ruthless world of corporate survival, emotions were a liability. It was time for the patriarch to step in and secure the asset. He buttoned his suit jacket, rolling his shoulders back to maximize his physical presence. Terrence was a tall man accustomed to intimidating subordinate executives and bullying local vendors simply by looming over them. He stopped 2 feet in front of me, planting his expensive leather shoes firmly onto the hardwood floor. He did not look at me first. Instead, he directed his attention entirely to Elias, attempting to establish a man-to-man, executive-to-executive dynamic that deliberately excluded the woman actually holding the $49 million check. Elias, my father said, his voice dropping into a low, conspiratorial baritone, meant to project absolute professional solidarity. I have to admit, that was a brilliant execution on the merger. Keeping the acquisition totally blind until the funds cleared escrow is exactly the kind of aggressive, airtight maneuver I appreciate. I assume you are handling the immediate tax sheltering for the capital transfer. Elias did not offer a polite smile. He did not extend his hand. He simply took one deliberate step sideways, positioning himself slightly behind my right shoulder. The physical movement was a masterclass in corporate body language. It instantly communicated to everyone in the room that Elias was not the decision maker. He was the sword, and I was the hand wielding it. Terrence's jaw tightened as the realization hit him. He was not going to be able to bypass me by appealing to my attorney. He was going to have to negotiate directly with the daughter he had just spent an hour publicly humiliating. He turned his gaze down to me, pasting on a tight, profoundly unnatural smile. The sheer desperation vibrating beneath his polished exterior was almost palpable. Kendra, my father said, injecting his tone with a heavy dose of manufactured authoritative pride, you kept this incredibly close to the chest. A bold strategic maneuver. You let us push you, you let us test your limits, and you use that pressure to forge a diamond. I respect that. I truly do. You have proven that you actually possess the vanguard spirit. I stared at him, my face a mask of absolute ice. He was actually trying to spin a decade of relentless emotional abuse and financial abandonment into a calculated training program. He was trying to take credit for my grit. But holding liquid capital of this staggering magnitude is an entirely different ballgame than writing software. Terrence continued, his hands gesturing expansively as he shifted seamlessly into his corporate pitch. $49 million is a massive liability if left exposed to the open market. The federal government will absolutely bleed you dry with capital gains taxes by the end of the fiscal quarter if this money is not immediately and aggressively sheltered. I let him talk. I wanted every single politician, judge, and investor in the private dining room to hear exactly how quickly his narrative shifted when a multi-million-dollar check was placed on the table. We need to be smart about this, Terrence proclaimed, slipping effortlessly into the royal we. I am going to have my executive assistant clear my entire schedule for tomorrow. We need to get you in front of my primary wealth management team at 8 sharp. We will pool these new resources directly into the Vanguard primary holding accounts. By absorbing your capital into the family trust, we can shield it under our corporate umbrella. Utilize our existing real estate depreciation to offset your tax burden and protect our wealth from predatory taxation. Down at the table, Connor sat up straight, nodding with vigorous, desperate enthusiasm. Exactly, Connor chimed in, his voice cracking slightly with greed. Terrence is absolutely right, Kendra. You cannot just leave that kind of cash sitting in a personal portfolio. It needs to be funneled into the established family trust, where experienced managers can allocate it effectively. The sheer blinding audacity of their proposal hung heavily in the air. 10 minutes ago, I was a tragic, undisciplined failure who was fundamentally ill-equipped to handle real assets. My father had literally stood on a stage and declared that passing wealth to a weak mind like mine would snap my neck. Now, with $49 million sitting in my hands, I was suddenly the prodigal savior. He was not trying to protect me from the IRS. I was trying to absorb my cash payout, to inject life-saving liquidity into his suffocating debt-ridden logistics company, and he was disguising his financial parasitism as paternal protection. I tightened my grip on the heavy presentation board holding my check. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to absolutely shatter his illusion of control. There is no we, Terrence, I stated, my voice echoing with a cold clinical finality. And there is absolutely no our wealth. My father's smile faltered, a dark, dangerous shadow passing over his eyes. His patriarchal authority was being directly challenged in front of the most influential people in Atlanta, and his temper was notoriously short when he felt disrespected. Kendra, listen to me very carefully. Terrence warned, his tone dropping the supportive father act and adopting a harsh dictatorial edge. You are swimming in waters that are far too deep for you. You are a tech developer. You build apps. You do not understand how aggressive the financial sector is at this tier of wealth. You are going to be surrounded by predators who will smile in your face while they drain your accounts. You need the protection of the family trust. You need my infrastructure to secure your future. I let out a soft, dry laugh that lacked any real humor. Your infrastructure, I repeated, shaking my head slowly. Do you honestly believe I would hand over a single cent of my capital to a family trust that you just publicly and permanently removed me from? You stood at the head of that table and told this entire room that I was too stupid to manage a checking account. You handed the keys to the kingdom to Aaliyah because she was the only one with the pedigree to protect it. Terrence stepped closer, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me into compliance. I was making a point about discipline, he hissed through gritted teeth, his eyes darting nervously toward the silent watching guests. You are acting purely on emotion right now. This is a business transaction. You put those petty grievances aside, and you protect the capital. You are my daughter, and you will not allow some misplaced sense of rebellion to jeopardize the family resources. I am not acting on emotion, I replied smoothly, meeting his furious gaze without blinking. I am acting on extremely accurate, highly verified data. My capital is already fully sheltered. My financial infrastructure is currently being managed by a team of elite wealth strategists in Manhattan who handle accounts that make Vanguard Logistics look like a neighborhood lemonade stand. I do not need your protection, Terrence. And I certainly do not need your outdated, desperately over-leveraged corporate umbrella. My father flinched as if I had physically struck him. The mention of leverage hit a nerve so raw and exposed that he actually took a half step backward. He realized in that exact moment that I knew far more about his financial situation than I was letting on. The only predator in this room, trying to drain my accounts with a smile on their face, is you. I continued, my voice sharp and unyielding. You do not want to shelter my money to protect my future. You want to pool our resources because you are desperate for cash flow. You want my $49 million to bail out the catastrophic mess you have made of your own empire. That is an outrageous, defamatory lie. Terrence barked, his voice booming across the dining room in a frantic attempt to shut down my narrative before his investors and banking partners heard another word. Vanguard Logistics is experiencing its most profitable quarter in a decade. We are expanding. We are acquiring new assets. You are completely out of your depth and you are humiliating yourself. I looked at the man who had spent his entire life valuing his public image over his own flesh and blood. He was willing to lie straight to my face to gaslight me in front of hundreds of people just to maintain his grip on power. He thought his booming voice and his custom suit could overwrite the mathematical reality of his failures. He thought he could just command me to surrender my life work to him because he was the patriarch and I was just the obedient, silent daughter. I had no idea that I had brought receipts. Before I could reach into Elias' premium leather folder to pull out the hard physical proof of his failing commercial loans, Connor decided it was his absolute duty to intervene. My brother-in-law pushed his chair back and stood up, holding his hands out in a deeply patronizing, placating gesture. He completely ignored the furious defensive sweat forming on my father's forehead. Connor saw a woman holding a $49 million check and his pure, unadulterated finance bro instincts immediately overrode his basic common sense. Let us all just take the temperature down a notch, Connor said, pasting on a smooth, practiced smile that he undoubtedly used to soothe nervous elderly clients at his boutique firm. Kendra, you are clearly experiencing an intense adrenaline rush right now. A liquidity event of this unprecedented magnitude is incredibly overwhelming, especially for someone who does not come from a traditional financial background. I slowly turned my head to look at him. I did not say a word. I simply let him dig his own grave. What Terrence is trying to explain, Connor continued, stepping forward and using a slow, measured cadence as if he were speaking to a highly reactive toddler, is that the federal tax burden on a sudden unstructured cash windfall is going to absolutely devastate your principal balance. You are looking at top-tier capital gains taxes, state levies, and potential alternative minimum tax triggers that could wipe out nearly 40% of that check before you even deposit it. The IRS is merciless. But I manage 8-figure portfolios every single day. I know exactly how to navigate this. If we act right now tonight, I can step in and manage the portfolio for you. I can set up the proper tax shelters, funnel the capital into the Vanguard Family Trust, and protect you from making a catastrophic amateur mistake. Connor puffed out his chest, looking immensely proud of his impromptu wealth management pitch. He truly believed he was swooping in to rescue the clueless, emotional tech girl from the big bad federal government. I looked at him with a level of clinical detached precision that made his confident smile begin to violently twitch. Connor, I said, my voice completely stripped of any inflection. You do not manage 8-figure portfolios. You are a junior vice president at a boutique firm where your only actual client is your grandfather inherited trust fund. You take old money, you place it into low-yield, exceptionally safe mutual funds, and you collect a management fee for essentially doing nothing. The color immediately drained from his face. Aaliyah let out a sharp gasp, her hands gripping the edge of the mahogany table. Furthermore, I continued, taking a single step toward him. You are attempting to explain corporate tax liability to the chief executive officer of a financial technology platform. NovaPay was structured from day one as a C corporation. Because I held my original founder's shares for over 5 years, this acquisition qualifies entirely under Section 1202 of the Internal Revenue Code. It is a qualified small business stock exemption. I am completely exempt from federal capital gains taxes on the first $10 million, and my legal team in New York executed a highly sophisticated corporate restructuring prior to the buyout that completely shielded the remaining balance. Connor's mouth fell open. He stood there completely paralyzed, his vast, arrogant ignorance brutally exposed in front of the most influential people in the city. So no, Connor, I stated, my voice echoing off the dark wood walls. I do not need you to manage my portfolio. I do not need you to save me from the IRS. And I absolutely do not need you to try and siphon my hard-earned capital into a failing family trust, just so you can pretend you are a real financial heavyweight. Sit down. Connor's legs literally gave out. He dropped back into his heavy leather chair like a stone, staring at his empty dinner plate in profound, irreversible humiliation. Brenda lunged forward, her emerald silk gown flashing in the chandelier light. She reached out and grabbed my forearm, her painted fingernails digging sharply into my skin. "Kendra, stop this right now," she hissed, her voice a frantic, desperate whisper. "You are making a terrible scene. You are embarrassing us in front of the entire community. Keep your voice down." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away gently. I yanked my arm back with a sudden, violent force that made my mother stumble. "Why should I keep my voice down?" I asked, raising my volume so that every single guest in the private dining room could hear me perfectly. I turned my back on my parents, facing the long table of elite politicians, wealthy benefactors, and country club socialites. They were all sitting in stunned, breathless silence, completely captivated by the absolute destruction of the Vanguard family facade. For the past 2 hours, I announced, projecting my voice with crystal-clear authority. I sat quietly at the very end of this table. I sat there while my mother loudly proclaimed to her friends that I was a profound mediocrity. I listened while she tragically lamented my lack of intellectual stamina. I stayed perfectly silent while my brother-in-law offered to help me balance a poverty-level budget. I pointed a finger directly at my father, who was standing frozen by the head of the table. And then I continued, my voice trembling with decades of suppressed righteous fury. I listened to the patriarch of this family stand on a stage and call me a defective asset. I listened to him tell this entire room that I lacked the discipline to handle real wealth. He called me the dumb one. He called me a failure. He publicly cut me out of his will to ensure that you all knew exactly how much he despised my independence. The wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. A local judge looked down at his lap, deeply ashamed that he had raised his glass and cheered during my father-cruel toast. "You wanted an audience, Terrence!" I shouted, the sheer force of my anger finally breaking through my calm exterior. You wanted everyone in Atlanta to know exactly how you treat the daughter who refused to submit to your control. You demanded applause for your tough love. You wanted them to praise you for cutting me off and throwing me away. I held up the massive presentation board, the $49 million check catching the light from the chandeliers. "So let them see the result of your tough love," I demanded. "Let them see that the daughter you called a stupid, tragic failure just sold a company for more liquid cash than your entire logistics empire has generated in 10 years. Let them see that your golden child, the Harvard Law graduate you just praised as the ultimate heir, spent the entire evening mocking a woman who could buy her entire life 10 times over. The perfectly curated, highly polished image of the perfect Black society family shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The facade was completely obliterated. My parents had spent their entire lives building a reputation based on superiority, prestige, and flawless grace. In less than 5 minutes, I had exposed them as cruel, financially desperate hypocrites who abused their own child to feed their massive, fragile egos. My mother buried her face in her hands, letting out a wretched, genuine sob of absolute social ruin. She knew that by tomorrow morning, every single woman at her country club would be whispering about this exact moment. She knew she would never be able to show her face at a charity gala again without people staring at her in profound disgust. Alia was crying two silent, angry tears, ruining her immaculate makeup. Her perfect graduation dinner the night that was supposed to crown her as the undisputed queen of the Vanguard legacy was completely destroyed. She was no longer the star of the show. She was just the arrogant, cruel younger sister who had picked a fight with a titan and lost everything. I stood in the center of the room breathing heavily, the adrenaline coursing through my veins like electricity. The truth was finally out in the open, raw and unfiltered. But I was not finished. The social destruction was satisfying, but the financial execution was still waiting in Elias' leather folder. It was time to deliver the final lethal blow to my father-crumbling empire. The heavy silence that followed my declaration was abruptly shattered by the sharp, violent screech of wood scraping against hardwood. Aaliyah shoved her heavy mahogany chair back so forcefully it nearly tipped over. The pristine, untouchable Harvard law, graduate the woman who had spent her entire life cultivating an image of flawless aristocratic grace, completely snapped. The transformation was instantaneous and pathetic. The sophisticated legal mind evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a deeply spoiled, furiously entitled child throwing a temper tantrum because someone else had dared to open a bigger present at her party. "Get out!" Aaliyah shrieked, her voice cracking into a shrill, guttural pitch that made several guests physically flinch. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. Her pristine white designer suit suddenly looked ridiculous against her flushed, blotchy skin. The heavy diamond earrings she wore swung wildly as she shook her head, entirely unable to process the reality of her shattered spotlight. "This is my night!" Aaliyah screamed, slamming her hand down flat against the table, rattling the fine crystal glasses. "This dinner is about my graduation. It is about my achievements. You do not get to walk in here after 10 years of doing absolutely nothing and hijack my celebration with some flashy, tasteless stunt." I did not move. I held the presentation board effortlessly, letting her drown in her own toxic insecurity. Her reaction was exactly what I had anticipated. She could not handle a universe where she was not the undisputed center of gravity. "You think a check changes who you are?" Aaliyah scoffed, her upper lip curling into a sneer of pure, desperate elitism. She stepped away from her chair, pacing frantically behind Connor, trying to reclaim the narrative. "You think dropping a ridiculous sum of money on a table suddenly makes you my equal? You are still exactly the same person who could not handle a basic university curriculum. You are still the dropout. You have zero pedigree, Kendra. Money does not buy class. And it certainly does not buy you a seat at this table." Connor reached up, desperately grabbing at the hem of Aaliyah's suit jacket. He tugged at it, his eyes darting frantically toward Elias and the watching investors. "Aaliyah, stop!" he hissed through his teeth, his wealth manager survival instincts screaming at him to de-escalate the situation. "You are making it worse. Just sit down." Aaliyah viciously slapped his hand away. "Do not tell me to sit down." She spat, her eyes wild and unfocused. She turned her furious gaze back to me, gripping the edge of the table as she leaned forward. "You are nothing but a lottery winner," Aaliyah proclaimed, her voice echoing off the dark wood-paneled walls. "You got lucky with some volatile piece of software. That is not real business. That is a fluke. Real wealth takes generations to build. It takes discipline and strategy. You think you won tonight just because you have cash. But I am still the true heir to this family." She gestured wildly toward our father, who was still standing frozen at the head of the table, sweating profusely under the unforgiving glare of the chandeliers. "I am inheriting a physical, tangible empire." Aaliyah boasted, her voice dripping with absolute delusion. "Vanguard Logistics is a cornerstone of this regional economy. I am taking over real commercial assets, real shipping contracts, and a $15 million estate. I am stepping into an executive suite that commands actual respect. You can wave your little novelty check around all you want, Kendra, but I am the one walking out of here with a dynasty. The sheer scale of her ignorance was staggering. She was standing in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta, loudly bragging about inheriting a commercial fleet that was currently bleeding capital from every single axle. She was boasting about a $15 million mansion that was suffocated by toxic mortgages. She had spent 3 years at a prestigious Ivy League law school, and yet she had never once bothered to look at her own family balance sheets. She had blindly trusted the patriarchal illusion our father had spun for her. "Take your lawyer, take your tasteless display, and get out of my restaurant," Aaliyah demanded, pointing toward the heavy mahogany doors. "Go back to whatever lonely, isolated life you came from. We do not want you here. We do not need your money. We are the Vanguard legacy, and you will never ever be a part of it." Alia stood there, chest heaving, waiting for me to shatter. She was waiting for me to drop my gaze, to succumb to her Harvard-polished bullying, to turn around and walk out the door in shame. She wanted to believe that her harsh words could somehow invalidate the $49 million reality standing right in front of her. I looked at her, and for the first time in my entire life, I did not feel a single ounce of resentment toward my sister. I did not feel jealousy. I did not feel anger. I felt nothing but profound, absolute pity. She was a puppet dancing on strings she could not even see, fighting to the death to defend a kingdom made entirely of rot. I slowly lowered the presentation board, handing the massive check to Elias, who took it with a solemn nod. I did not break eye contact with Aaliyah. I let the silence stretch out, allowing her frantic, desperate energy to hang in the warm air of the dining room. I let the politicians and the banking executives fully absorb the unhinged reality of the golden child. I reached into the inner pocket of my simple navy dress. I bypassed my phone and wrapped my fingers around a folded, heavily embossed legal document I had personally retrieved from Elias earlier that afternoon. It was the secondary piece of paperwork, the final lethal strike I had been holding in reserve for exactly this moment. Alia wanted to talk about real estate. She wanted to talk about tangible assets and the glorious Vanguard dynasty. She had practically begged me to dismantle her entire reality. I pulled the folded document from my pocket. I did not raise my voice. The absolute quiet of the room guaranteed that every single syllable I spoke would land with the force of a sledgehammer. I looked at the golden child, the perfect heir to a broken throne, and prepared to drop the karma she so richly deserved. I held the thick parchment paper between my fingers, feeling the heavy embossed seal at the bottom corner. I did not rush. I let the absolute silence of the room stretch out, allowing Aaliyah to stand there in her pristine white suit, breathing heavily, completely unaware that she was standing on a trapdoor I had unlocked days ago. "You want to talk about tangible assets," I said, my voice projecting with a calm, surgical precision that cut through the lingering tension. "You want to talk about the physical, glorious reality of the Vanguard dynasty. You stood there and told this entire room that you are inheriting a commercial powerhouse. You accused me of being an uneducated dropout who does not understand how real wealth is built." I took a slow step forward, closing the distance between myself and the head of the table. Alia instinctively took a half step back, bumping into Connor's chair. "But a Harvard law degree is completely useless if you lack the basic common sense to audit your own family before you publicly brag about their money." I continued, locking my eyes directly onto my father. "Let us talk about real business, Terrence. Let us talk about what Vanguard Logistics actually looks like when you peel away the country club memberships and the expensive custom suits." My father's face drained of all remaining color. He opened his mouth to speak, to issue a booming command to shut me down, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He recognized the specific legal document in my hand. He knew exactly what it was, and the sheer terror radiating from his eyes confirmed it to every single investor sitting at that mahogany table. "Vanguard Logistics is not a cornerstone of the regional economy," I announced, turning my gaze to address the wealthy politicians and banking executives who had been singing his praises all evening. "The company has not secured a profitable freight contract in over 2 years. They have been suffocating under the weight of catastrophic operational mismanagement and astronomical diesel costs. To keep up appearances, Terrence took out 3 massive high-interest lines of commercial credit Borrowing against non-existent future revenue. Vanguard Logistics is not expanding. It has been secretly functionally bankrupt for 8 straight months. A collective horrified murmur swept across the private dining room. The local city judge, who had just raised a glass to my father, Legacy, slowly lowered his hand and stared at Terence in profound disgust. The facade was cracking violently, massive chunks of their high society image hitting the floor. "That is a lie," Aaliyah shrieked, her voice frantic and shrill. She grabbed her husband's shoulder, shaking him. "Connor, tell her she is lying. Tell them Vanguard is solvent." Connor did not look at his wife. He was staring at the legal document in my hand, his wealth manager brain calculating the horrific reality of his situation. He was a man obsessed with marrying into old money and prestige, and he was currently realizing that he had legally bound himself to a mountain of toxic commercial debt. He looked physically nauseated. "Last Thursday, I continued speaking over Aaliyah. Desperate denial. Your chief financial officer finalized a highly confidential emergency bailout. He was weeks away from filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy, which would have exposed this entire financial disaster to the public. To avoid the humiliation, Terence authorized the fire sale of Vanguard remaining viable shipping routes. You sold the company failing debt to an anonymous private equity firm based out of Manhattan, begging them for a cash injection just to keep the lights on and the payroll funded through the end of the quarter." My mother pressed her hands against her cheeks, letting out a low, whimpering sound. Brenda had built her entire identity on being the affluent, untouchable matriarch of Buckhead. Now her most elite friends were watching her husband be exposed as a desperate, over-leveraged fraud. "I am the primary shareholder of that private equity firm," I stated, dropping the hammer with absolute, unrelenting force. "I bought your failing debt for pennies on the dollar. I authorized the acquisition of your commercial leases, and I am the one who currently holds the notes on every single delivery truck bearing the Vanguard logo. You do not have an empire, Terence. You are an employee of my holding company, and your business is scheduled for complete liquidation by the end of next month." Terence collapsed backward into his heavy leather chair. The self-proclaimed patriarch, the man who had demanded total submission and respect, looked like a hollow, defeated shell. He stared blankly at the white tablecloth, entirely unable to look me in the eye. He had spent his entire life trying to prove he was superior to everyone around him, and he had just been financially conquered by the daughter he discarded. Alia was hyperventilating now. Her chest heaved beneath her designer suit as she frantically shook her head, utterly refusing to process the destruction of her reality. "No," Alia stammered, pointing a trembling finger at the keys resting on the table. "The house. Dad just gave me the house. It is in an irrevocable trust. It belongs to Connor and me. The estate is worth $15 million. You cannot touch the primary estate." I looked at my younger sister with a mixture of profound pity and absolute exhaustion. She was clinging to a fairy tale that had never actually existed. I unfolded the heavy document in my hands and placed it flat on the table right next to the keys for her leased Tesla. "That brings us to your spectacular graduation present," I said, my voice dropping into a tone of quiet, lethal certainty. "Did you really think a man who was quietly drowning in commercial debt could afford to hand over a $15 million asset free and clear? You did not inherit a fortress, Aaliyah. You inherited a trap." I tapped the paperwork with my index finger. "The Vanguard mansion in Buckhead has been leveraged against the business 3 separate times. Terence drained all the equity out of that house years ago to fund his failing contracts and maintain your mother luxury lifestyle. The property was underwater. The bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings 3 weeks ago. They were going to post the eviction notice on your front door by next Monday." Brenda let out a sharp, devastated sob, burying her face in her hands. The secret she had been desperately hiding from her country club friends was out in the open. The absolute shame of facing a bank foreclosure was completely unendurable for a woman so obsessed with appearances. "To protect the collateral of my new corporate acquisition," I explained, looking directly into Alia's horrified eyes. "My holding company stepped in and purchased the heavily defaulted deed from the bank last Tuesday. We paid off the outstanding arrears and assumed total ownership of the property." The words landed like physical blows. Aaliyah took a staggering step backward, nearly tripping over her own high heels. Dad did not put that house into an irrevocable trust for you tonight, I stated, driving the final nail into the coffin of their generational dynasty. He could not legally transfer the title because his name is no longer on it. He brought you to this restaurant and lied to your face. He lied to this entire room to save his own bruised ego. He wanted to play the role of the generous king one last time before the bank took the crown away. I looked down at the keys resting on the table, then back up to my sister. You do not own a dynasty, Aaliyah. You own absolutely nothing. That $15 million mansion, the estate, you just proudly claimed as your rightful inheritance, belongs entirely, legally, and exclusively to me. The private dining room fell into a silence so profound it felt like the oxygen had been completely vacuumed from the air. The elite guests, the politicians, and the Ivy League friends sat completely paralyzed. They had just witnessed a public, undisputed execution of a prominent Atlanta family. They had watched a young woman walk into a room as a rejected outcast and systematically, brutally dismantle an entire corporate and social empire in under 10 minutes. Connor finally moved. He stood up from his chair, his face a mask of furious, profound betrayal. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Terrence and Brenda. He had spent 4 years playing the obedient son-in-law, catering to their massive egos, because he believed he was securing his place in a lucrative financial dynasty. He had just realized that he had married into a bankrupt, heavily indebted family that was currently facing total social and financial ruin. Without a single word, Connor turned his back on Aaliyah, marched briskly across the dining room, and walked straight out the double doors. Aaliyah let out a pathetic, desperate whimper as her husband abandoned her. She reached out toward the empty space he left behind, but he did not even pause. The golden child, the perfect Harvard graduate, was left standing completely alone in her ruined white suit, staring at the shattered remains of a legacy that had never truly been hers to claim. The crushing reality of Connor abandoning ship was the final catalyst. Aaliyah stood trembling in her ruined designer suit, her eyes darting frantically toward the heavy mahogany doors where her husband had just disappeared. She looked back at our parents, silently begging Terrence to fix it, to boom his voice across the room, and magically repair the shattered illusion of their empire. But Terrence had absolutely nothing left to give. He sat slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the white tablecloth. The self-proclaimed king of logistics was nothing more than a broken, heavily indebted old man who had just been publicly stripped of his crown. Brenda finally stopped her theatrical sobbing. The tears dried up the exact second she realized there was no longer a sympathetic audience left to manipulate. The elite guests, the local politicians, and the wealthy country club benefactors were actively averting their eyes. They were physically leaning away from my parents, signaling their immediate and permanent distancing from the Vanguard brand. In the ruthless circles of Atlanta, high society social contagion is a very real threat. My parents were now deeply infected with the stench of financial failure and profound deceit. Nobody wanted to be caught standing near the blast radius. I turned my attention back to Elias. With a single subtle nod, he opened his premium leather portfolio one last time. He withdrew a crisp, neatly stapled packet of legal documents and handed it to me. The paper felt heavy, substantial, and incredibly satisfying against my fingertips. I walked slowly toward the head of the table. The remaining guests parted like the Red Sea, pulling their chairs in to give me a wide, unobstructed path. I stopped directly in front of my father. I did not look down at him with anger or resentment. Anger requires a level of emotional investment that I simply no longer possessed. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I tossed the legal packet onto the table. It landed with a sharp smack right over his empty dessert plate, sliding just enough to bump against his crystal water glass. "What is this?" Terrence whispered. His voice was entirely devoid of its former booming arrogance. It was a raspy, defeated sound. "It is a standard market-rate residential lease agreement," I stated clearly, making sure the terms carried across the silent dining room. "Since my holding company officially owns the Buckhead estate, you and Brenda are currently occupying my property as unauthorized, non-paying tenants. I am not a monster, Terrence. I will not have my private security team forcibly remove you from the premises tonight. However, if you wish to remain in my house, you will sign that lease by tomorrow morning." My father stared at the document as if it were coated in poison. "Rent is due on the first of every month." I continued, my tone strictly business. "The monthly rate is set at current market value for a fully furnished $15 million luxury estate. There is no grace period. There are no familial discounts. If you miss a single payment by so much as 1 minute, my property management firm will initiate immediate formal eviction proceedings. You will be escorted off the grounds and the locks will be changed." Brenda let out a sharp, terrified gasp. "You cannot charge your own parents' rent!" she cried, her voice trembling with genuine, unadulterated panic. "We will be bankrupt within a week. We have absolutely no liquid capital left to cover a lease of that magnitude." "That sounds like a severe lack of intellectual stamina," I replied, throwing her exact words from earlier tonight right back into her face. "Perhaps you should try freelancing. I hear designing logos for local bakeries pays the rent perfectly fine." Brenda flinched, visibly shrinking back into her velvet chair. The sheer brutality of having her own degrading insults weaponized against her left her completely speechless. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She finally understood the absolute finality of the situation. There was no more safety net. There was no more generational wealth to hide behind. She was going to have to figure out how to survive in the real world, a world she had spent her entire life looking down upon. I turned my gaze away from my parents and looked at Aaliyah. My golden child sister was still clutching the leather key fob, her knuckles stark white against the dark material. Her entire world had collapsed in the span of 20 minutes. The prestigious Harvard degree, the wealthy husband, the guaranteed corporate dynasty. It was all entirely gone. She was staring at the undeniable realization that she would have to wake up tomorrow and actually work for a living, burdened by massive student loans and lifestyle maintenance costs without a multi-million-dollar safety net to catch her. She was left holding nothing but a car key. "Enjoy the Tesla, Alia," I said, my tone smooth and completely untroubled. "Make sure you keep up with the monthly insurance premiums, because as of tonight, it is the only physical asset any of you actually own." Aaliyah looked up at me, her eyes brimming with a mixture of hatred and absolute despair. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to hurl another useless insult, or to finally break down and beg for mercy, but she could not find the words. She was completely defeated. I did not wait for their responses. I did not need to see them sign the lease agreement right now, and I certainly did not need to stick around to hear their desperate manufactured apologies. The financial execution was complete. The social destruction was absolute. I had systematically dismantled their empire of lies, reclaimed my narrative, and secured my capital. My work here was done. I turned my back on them. It was a simple physical motion, but it carried the immense weight of a decade of liberation. I looked at Elias, offering him a small, genuine nod of profound gratitude. He returned the gesture, his imposing corporate mask securely back in place. We had executed the plan flawlessly. Together we walked away from the mahogany table. The heavy double doors of the private dining room stood open, revealing the brightly lit, bustling corridor of the restaurant. As I stepped through the threshold, I did not look back. I did not spare a single glance for the shattered remains of the Vanguard legacy. I could hear the frantic, panicked murmurs finally breaking out behind me as the elite guests unleashed their gossip, actively tearing my parents' social standing to absolute shreds. The restaurant staff quickly stepped aside, offering me respectful nods as I walked through the main dining room. I handed my valet ticket to the attendant at the front stand. He sprinted to retrieve my modest, unbranded sedan, completely unaware that he was handing the keys to a woman who could easily buy the entire restaurant block in cash. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors and into the warm, humid Atlanta evening. The thick summer air hit my face, carrying the faint, sweet scent of rain and blooming magnolias. I took a deep, cleansing breath, filling my lungs with the taste of absolute victory. I slipped into the driver's seat of my car, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. I drove into the glowing city lights, leaving my toxic family trapped in the dark, entirely and permanently free. The profound lesson here is that your true worth is never defined by those who are committed to misunderstanding you. When a toxic family labels you a failure to protect their own fragile egos, you do not have to internalize their narrative. Instead of fighting for a seat at a table that disrespects you, build your own empire in absolute silence. True power lies in financial and emotional independence. The ultimate revenge isn't about destroying your abusers, it is about reclaiming your narrative, establishing unbreakable boundaries, and walking away, so completely free that their toxic opinions no longer matter. Have you ever had to silently build your own success to prove toxic people wrong? Share your triumphant journey in the comments below and hit subscribe for more empowering stories of reclaiming your worth.